Welcome to our second film inquiry roundtable. My name is Kristy Strouse. I'm writer and operations manager for Film Inquiry. I'm currently in Maine, the state of Maine, and today we're talking about standout characters, and that could be good or bad, those we love, hate, ones that leave an impression, and that could be TV or film. And before we start, I'd like to just go around and share who is with us today. Some from across the pond, which is amazing. So I'll start with Maria, and then you guys can just go ahead after that.
Hi guys, I'm Maria, and I've been writing for Film Inquiry for about a year and a few months. And yeah, I'm based in London, but I am actually from Finland originally.
Awesome.
So I'll go. I'm the other one joining from across the pond, I think. So my name's Jim. I've written for Film Inquiry for about a year, I think, maybe slightly less. And then various other places for quite a bit longer than that, features and reviews and stuff. I'm currently in Edinburgh, and I'm originally from Dundee, slightly north of there. So I lived in England for a little bit, but this is where I've been most of the time and where I do most of my film watching and so forth.
Awesome.
I'm Danny Anderson, and I'm in Pennsylvania, in the U.S. I'm originally from Cleveland, Ohio, but I teach at a little college, and so you go where the work is, and so I'm in PA. And I think I've been writing for Film Inquiry for around a year or so, and it's usually I'm just kind of drawn to things for very quirky reasons at a given time, and I decide to write an essay about it, and so.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for being here. It's great to see some of you that I haven't met before, even if it is just through this strange thing. But yeah, and how's everybody doing right now? You know, with everything going on.
Pretty good. Very bored. I'm furloughed from my day job, so it's literally a lot of films. So I'm very well prepared for this chat.
Plus side, silver lining.
I'm also furloughed from my day job. I'm actually watching less films than I thought I would be, which is probably a bad thing for me to be saying on a Film Inquiry roundtable. But I seem to have dipped more into TV series, I think. Like I've been watching Westworld, I've started watching Ozark, various other things. I'm still getting through quite a few films as well, but I don't think it was any more than I was before, which was quite high, admittedly. But I think just people might expect me to be getting through more, I think, potentially. But, you know, otherwise largely okay. I mean, about as well as you can under the current circumstances, I suppose.
Right. Well, that's why I think it's great to do these things, too, to get some interaction and have some fun and, you know, get to meet you guys and chat about the things that we obviously very passionate about, you know, and TV is part of that. There's a lot of great TV characters. And I just want to say I love Ozark. Awesome. And I am currently binging the rest of this season of Westworld, so I'm also in that same kind of boat. So yeah, I guess I'll start. You know, one of my favorite heroes and one of my favorite villains exists in the same movie, so that's not always going to be the case, but it's a film that I kind of feel like just fires on all cylinders. It's Jonathan Demme's Silence of the Lambs. And Clarice was, you know, Jodie Foster's character was very inspiring to me. And I think she's one of those strong female characters that's just, I mean, she's just amazing. But then on the other end, you know, we have Anthony Hopkins, Hannibal Lecter, who is also one of my favorite villains. So it's kind of an interesting, their dynamic and their conversations are, you know, really, I think, a big part of what makes that movie just as amazing as it is.
It's so weird that you mentioned it. I'm actually reading the book right now. I have it like, literally at my desk while you're. I'd never read the book before, so yeah, it's great.
It's actually it's a bit. I fully agree with the choice of Hannibal Lecter, but it's quite an interesting choice in that you could argue that one character has given rise to 3 different performances of it, which are all really pretty good in their own ways. Because obviously, like Anthony Hopkins is the iconic one, but before that you had Brian Cox and Michael Mann's Manhunter playing Hannibal Lecter, and then of course you had Mads Mikkelsen doing it in the TV series as well. So you've got 3 iterations of that character who are all very good. Well, I think Anthony Hopkins is definitely the the most essential one, if that's a phrase that we're going to allow. But yeah, it's an excellent choice for that.
I think that Mads is really great, though. That's my favorite show. I love Hannibal, and he brought such a I don't know, just sort of a, I don't know how to say it, but he's like a human puzzle. His face is so indecipherable, and it's such a great performance because he can simultaneously be like lovable and horrifying at the same moment because of his like ambiguous face. And so I really am so thrilled with all of his performances in that role. I'm really mad that the Clarice series got taken away from Brian Fuller, and it got picked up by some CBS thing. So yeah.
Yeah, and I agree. Matt Mikkelsen is amazing, and I just kind of like separate them in my mind, but he is just, and I'm actually just rewatching that show, so I've got a few that I'm currently going into, which obviously that show didn't get to really fulfill what it wanted, but I do think it's a terrific show as well. So is there anybody else that wants to jump in with like a character that, hero, villain, something like that?
I think for me, the sort of first character that I really connected with was Buffy from Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Mm-hmm. It used to be on, because I obviously grew up in Finland, it used to be on really late at night, and I had a TV in my room, so I would go to bed and I'd secretly watch it in the middle of the night, and I'd be a little bit scared, but at the same time I'd be really sort of, I don't know, it felt a really deep connection to this character. And it's just someone that has taught me so much about being a woman and being a woman in a world that is a very scary place for a woman to be in. So I think that's been really influential for me throughout my entire life, really.
Yeah, that's a great choice.
I think that there's not many. One of the great things about cinema is that there's a million things you could pick for this. I think one of the ones that I remember first, this is going to sound really stupid, but one of the ones that I first remember remembering, if that makes sense, right? That actually kind of like stuck with me after I saw the film was probably the original animated Jungle Book, to be honest with you, and Shere Khan. But I think that's the first time I can remember a villain actually kind of like staying in my head, because I did, my dad worked at sea, so he'd come back with these like bootlegs of Disney classics on VHS or something, and I'd watch these things on loop. But the only one I can really have any real memory of to this day is probably the Jungle Book in particular, and then on a villain front, Shere Khan. So I would say that, and then that kind of, it's interesting to see how that gets reimagined later, when they did the live action, inverted commas, release of it a few years ago. And I think Idris Elba did quite a good job with it. But that original version, that's the first time I can remember sort of like noticing a villain. I think the first time I was utterly terrified by one, and I don't think this is necessarily a good character, but it is terrifying, was the T-1000 in Terminator 2. I watched that film when I was way too young to be watching it, quite frankly. And I think I refused to basically like turn the lights out for about several weeks afterwards, because I basically just had this image, like, when the hand turns into a knife and you like impale somebody on a fridge or something like that. Honest to God, absolutely scared out of my mind. So like, not necessarily a great character and kind of like roundedness, but in terms of like impact and scare levels, my God.
I've always been drawn to, like, I guess the tragic hero sort of trope, and probably because I always loved the Wolfman since I was a little kid, the old black, the Lon Chaney Jr., Larry Talbot, right? And so that sort of like set the template for me. So when I think of like characters that really stuck out for me, I am not like a binge watcher by nature. It's really hard for me to sit all day and watch a single thing, but I did this with Penny Dreadful. And really almost all the characters in Penny Dreadful probably fit this mold, but particularly Vanessa, Eva Green's Vanessa, is just such a great character because she's just sort of like kind of doomed because of like her upbringing and just sort of the tragic events of her youth, and yet she sort of tries to do good as much as she can, kind of in that world of gothic horror, and so yeah, I particularly love that series. I have not seen the new one yet, the City of Angels one. I haven't. I don't get Showtime, so I have to find another venue to get that. But I really loved Penny Dreadful, and the creature, the Frankenstein's creature in that series too is just amazing. And I was literally like yelling at the screen in the last season, like, don't do this to him, right? I was so like empathetic towards that character.
Yeah,
I think what's really interesting, sort of, especially going back to Silence of the Lambs, is are all good characters, are they tied to good performances? Because you've got Hannibal Lecter and you've got 3 great performances, like Jim said, but sort of the groundwork has already been made and done by the writer, Thomas Harris. So I think that's quite interesting to think about. Is there any characters that, you know, they might be good, great characters, but the performance was a bit lacking?
I think so. And I think also, are they the right choice for it? Because, you know, no offense to the second Hannibal, but, and, you know, I mean, I think that she provided, what's her name?
Julianne Moore?
Yes, Julianne Moore. I think she's an amazing actress. She's always amazing. But I don't think she fit that character in the same way as Jodie Foster. And it's, I mean, sometimes, you know, it might be like biased because you saw her already and you love that movie. But I honestly just think that she wasn't the right one for that. So I think it has a lot to do with the writing. It also has a lot to do with the performances, casting correctly. They just have to kind of all, you know, click.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I think you're 100% right. I think that there's a certain amount that can be put into the script, but it does. I think to elevate it to another level, it needs a good performance as well. Because I mean, I think there's plenty of you know, I mean, you can look at literary adaptations, and not all of them are great, but you know from the source that you've got good characters there. But that doesn't mean in every single one that necessarily comes across on film. By the same token, though, you can get a very talented performer who takes something which, if you look at the script, is perhaps a little bit thin. But because they're a talented performer, they can really get more out of it. I think when you've got those two elements together, that's when you then start to have something which is both good and memorable as well. And I think really that's probably what the case with Clarice Starling, really, because I think you've got that in Silence of the Lambs. You've got an excellent Jodie Foster performance, and you've got good writing and a good source. But then when you come to Hannibal, like, I think we all know Julianne Moore is very talented. She's done a lot of great work. But that, I mean, I've read both books, and that book, in my opinion anyway, is definitely not as well realized. And I think that then comes through in a production and a film itself, which also wasn't. So unfortunately, on that occasion, she hasn't been able to bring up there. But I think if you get the two of them together, that's when lightning strikes, I suppose, is maybe the way of putting it.
Yeah, that question is interesting. I've been talking with a friend of mine about the Star Wars prequels, and like, Ewan McGregor is legitimately great in that role in a way that nobody else in the movie is, right? And so there's something about what he's able to do with his character, written by the same mind who wrote Anakin's characters, right? And yet he brings it to life in a way that other people can't. Other talented actors, Natalie Portman's great, right? But there's something so wooden about the script there that her performance doesn't quite overcome for me in the way that that Ewan McGregor's does in that. So yeah, it is a real interesting puzzle.
It's interesting you say Ewan McGregor, actually, because going into this chat, this is probably something I probably should have thought of beforehand, but he's actually responsible for another character which I'm going to stop short of saying I identify with, but I definitely connected with, and that's Renton from Trainspotting. Now, the reason for that is I have a lot of fondness for that film, just because it captures something about how, and bear in mind, I didn't see it until I was kind of a young teenager. It came out kind of before I would have been able to see it, but from when it was made up until when I watched it, it captures something about that feeling of being Scottish and Scottish society at the time. It's obviously about, it's about addiction. It follows a group of drug addicts, but there's something about their attitude which really captures a mood of the nation to a certain extent. And I think when you watch that as kind of a young person who was kind of making sense of Scotland's place within the UK at the time. So this would have been like pre-devolution, basically. There's something about that you really connect with, and the attitudes and stuff that was held there. So Ewan McGregor is an interesting one, but that's a good example of when stuff comes together, because obviously you had a very controversial but accomplished Irvine Welsh novel that underpinned that, and then you put a good performance in there as well, and you end up with something very, very memorable.
Yeah, I love Trainspotting, and I'm not from the UK, but that movie's very sentimental to me. I probably watched it far too young, but I love that movie. It kind of was another one to go back to our previous video, but kind of shaped me as a film fan as well. Mm-hmm. And I love most of Danny Boyle's films, so great choice there. So I'm also like to talk about some of those in TV, and you mentioned kind of like tragic. Danny, you said that you like some characters that are kind of tragic, or I mean, there's a lot of anti-heroes in TV, so I guess I could kind of like segue into both of these. But yeah, I'll start with the anti-heroes first. Like I love Tony Soprano and Walter White. Those are two, and there are so many kinds of anti-heroes. There's even like Katie Seagal's character, Gemma Teller, if you ever watched that show. And yeah, so there's a lot, but those two in particular, just mainly because I think those are two of my favorite series, on a longer list especially. I think that they are both so amazing and so iconic, but they're obviously not good people. They make a lot of horrible choices, and there's times you want to scream at them. Oh, and Benjamin Linus in Lost. I don't know if anyone watched Lost, but he's also... No, not so much.
No, I stuck with Lost up until about season 4, I think, and then I'm not gonna lie, I did start to slowly drift from it at that point. I enjoyed it while I watched it, but it's just I've never felt the pull back in,
Yeah, I have to admit I'm a pretty big Lost supporter, so I'm always gonna fight the good fight for that one. But yeah, so The Sopranos and Breaking Bad are two, in my opinion, shows that are kind of are huge in our just television growth, in a sense. Like, I mean, as far as what they've done for TV and how monumental they've been. And yeah, so is there any...
I think when I think about Tony Soprano, I love The Sopranos too. And I feel like he's compelling as a character because his good actions and his bad actions all spring from the same kind of value system, right? So everything he does that's good and things that's bad are all, even though they seem wildly inconsistent, but they're actually consistent in that they come from the same place. So he's a really, I think, well-developed character, because I think he's something we can look, he's a character that we can look to kind of talk about the complexity of being human, right? And so because he's very difficult to categorize as either good or bad, which I guess is why he's kind of a template for the anti-hero in that way. But yeah, it's, I think because his value system is consistent, and it actually, I think there's something unified about all of his actions, good or bad. And I think, and part of that is certainly the performance coming together with the writing there. It's an all-time TV performance by James Gandolfini there.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I've watched a fair chunk of The Sopranos. I haven't watched all of it. I'm gonna disagree. Not disagree. What am I talking about? Good garbling words. I'm going to agree very strongly with the Walter White suggestion. And I also think as that series progressed, I think Walter White was an interesting one in that what you thought of him seemed to say more about you than it did about him, because you had this very weird situation where, particularly in the middle of its run, like you'd have these people kind of like just venom, like with absolute venom going after the Skylar White character, his wife. Just making out that she was like the worst thing ever, when in reality, like, really, I think most people in that scenario would behave like Skylar White. I mean, she was the like at that point in the run, she was the one who was not an absolute megalomaniac, ego-driven narcissist. So I find that an interesting character in the sense that, like, he does gradually become more monstrous over the series run, but it was done by little shifted increments, right? So you start off with sympathizing with him, or at least having empathy with like what he's looking to do, and then before you know it, you're like, oh my god, this guy's a monster. And I think just at what point you cottoned onto that, and over that kind of like 5-season narrative, at what point you cottoned onto that, I found quite interesting. So from that perspective, I also think he's quite an interesting character in that regard, beyond kind of like, again, and I think the writing team on that, how well they've done with Better Call Saul, also shows the amount of talent in the writing of that series. But again, that's another one where the writing and the performance come together to just, pitch it perfectly, I think.
Yeah, and I do think, like, still root for him, even though this, you still, like, want him to change. You want him to, and I think a big part of that, too, is Aaron Paul, Jesse's character, like, their relationship also kind of softens him a little bit, because that he does care about him, even though he does a lot of horrible things to him. But, that kind of elevates him from beyond that monster, too. Who, like, it's a very interesting character, and it is interesting to see how people perceive him.
Yeah, no, I agree with Skylar. I've never understood the hate towards her, but I think with Walter, as he becomes more and more monstrous, we do still see the context for his actions. We sort of understand where they're coming from, but with Skylar, we're never sort of afforded that. She just seems sort of hysterical, even though most of us would act exactly like she does. But yeah, she's never given that context for her feelings, really.
Agree. Yeah, I think Skylar does get kind of a bad rap. I don't understand it either, honestly. She tries to adapt to a ridiculously, unexpected, wild, set of circumstances, and does what she can to survive that. And I realized I said Gemma Teller. I don't know if anyone watches Sons of Anarchy or ever watched Sons of Anarchy, but Katie Sagal is just amazing as Gemma Teller. Anyone know?
Yeah, no, she's great. Yeah, she's great in it. She's great in it. And again, I think it's because everything that she does comes from a place that we really understand. She's a very well-rounded character, and I think what really sells her is that she's very unsympathetic, but again, it's sold off on the performance, because the performance is so strong that we want to like her and we want to be on her side. So I think that's just a really good example, again, of a character that you shouldn't like, but you do.
Yeah, I think she has a family. That's a big part of her drive, even though she does horrible things.
I haven't seen Sons of Anarchy keeps popping up in my recommendations, and I've still not watched it. It sounds like basically I should get around to doing that. But in describing what you like about that character, I think that also gets to the heart of, particularly in the case of villains, when you actually connect with one and you find it impressive, and it's when they have, I'm not going to say good motivations, because obviously that's ridiculous, but clear motivations. Because like there's a lot of like, I find that like the Marvel films, which I have a mixed relationship with, like they get a lot of flack for villains, right? There's all this talk about kind of like the Marvel villain problem. I don't really buy it, right? But the best ones that they have are the ones where you clearly understand their motivations, right? I mean, that's beyond like what we've spoken about in terms of like, if there's a good performance and there's a bit of charisma behind it, like you pretty clearly understand what is going on with Loki in the first Avengers film. You pretty clearly understand what is going on with Thanos in the two most recent Avengers ones. One that I actually have a bit of fondness for, which doesn't seem to get a lot of love online, is Daniel Bruhl's Zemo. Right, and again, I think that's another one where you understand the motivations. They don't necessarily need to be particularly complex ones, but if they're clear and you see what's happening, that's when it just makes it more interesting. And then by that happening, it automatically adds a few layers to the performance, and that's where the good writing thing can have different forms. Right, it can be a nuanced, layered character with complex motivations, or it can just be a very clear one, which then adheres to that kind of simple line. It's when it becomes muddied or you don't really understand what's going on, then, well, I mean, why would you connect with a character like that? But
Yeah, I actually really like Doctor Strange. It's like, I know it's like kind of a middling Marvel movie, and I think the villain is, again, Matt Mikkelsen, right? Plays Caecilius in that, and his motivation is really an extension of taking the good guy's ethos seriously, right? And so like his devotion to what he has been taught is actually what leads him to the evil actions, right? And so I think that is actually kind of interesting, and I think that in our real actually existing world, I mean, I think a lot of people pursue evil ends out of a devotion to something they perceive as good, right? And so, and I think Caecilius, and again, I really like Matt Mikkelsen, I guess, in everything. Now that we're talking about him again, but I think he's great in that movie.
Yeah,
True. I think a superhero film that did a villain really well was Shazam from DC, because the whole film starts with what's his name? Mark Strong's character, Dr. something.
Oh, I just rewatched it. I can't remember.
It's one of those things, because I know what you're saying. I agree. That's a great character. I can't remember the name at all.
No. I should know. Anyway, but he's allowed a lot more time, because a lot of times, I think this especially with Marvel, they spend so much time in the film setting up other things and the superheroes and their powers and all those dynamics, that there simply isn't enough room for the villains, which means that they just kind of show up in the third act, a massive battle ensues, but we have no emotional connection to that character and we don't understand their motivations other than good versus evil. But apart from that, it doesn't really go any deeper with those villains specifically. But again, the heroes, then we observe them through several films, so we make that connection over several hours that we spent through with them. So yeah, I think that's a huge thing as well.
Dr. Savannah. I just
there we go. There we go.
I looked it up. But the Spider-Man Homecoming, the same thing with Michael Keaton's Vulture, right? It begins with his story, really, and I think that makes him one of the more compelling villains in that universe.
Yeah. And I think if they like believe that they're doing something right, or they start off with good intentions, you know, it always makes for a much more layered, nuanced character. And you know, to kind of, and I love Loki. He's like one of my favorite, by the way. I just want to, Tom Hiddleston's awesome. But I you know, in like Christopher Nolan's Batmans, you know, like you know their intentions, they think that they're right. You know, like Ra's al Ghul, you know, he thinks that he is doing like the just thing, you know what I mean? And you know, obviously, if I'm going to mention that, I'm going to mention that, you know, Heath Ledger's the Joker in the second one because he's amazing. But yeah, so I think it's interesting when looking at like villains, they should have some kind of clear motivation as to why they're doing it. But also, it's interesting when they think that what they're doing, you know, is in a sense maybe heroic, even though it isn't.
And Ra's al Ghul is a good example of that. I think, like for my, like, I love Heath Ledger's performance in The Dark Knight, but in terms of kind of like the best character as a villain that was created for those films, I do think that Ra's al Ghul, played by Liam Neeson, is probably the best one. Which is probably like a, you know, it's probably heresy to say that about that Dark Knight trilogy, but. That's where it comes. It's when there's like it's like we said, it's when there's a clear motivation, and like I think in the Dark Knight that is there, but it's more kind of like this agent of anarchy type thing, right? That's the motivation. So yeah. It's interesting. It works and it gives a brilliant performance, but it's maybe like it's less something you could identify with, perhaps. Whereas Ra's al Ghul, that misguided idea, is something where you can kind of look at it and go, okay, you're a mass murdering maniac, but okay, I see where you started with that. You know, whereas you don't necessarily get that with the Joker, maybe. But,
yeah, and he's important to Bruce Wayne's, you know, trajectory and to become Batman. So it's also very integral into the story too. Yeah, so yeah, that I actually, I mean, it's not heresy, but I actually love all three movies. That's something I get a lot of heat for, is that I actually like Bane, but I don't put him in the same, you know, tiers as the other two.
I'd say that I like that. I like that.
I love
performance,
that.
but you know,
I like
it's not quite on the same level maybe as like the Joseph, but yeah, I mean, I think that fit, not to spin off into a complete kind of like side thing about that trilogy, but I think like that the last film, The Dark Knight Rises, right? It has a lot of issues, but I enjoyed it, and I think it wrapped everything up very nicely. And part of that is the villains and the way they hark back to that first film in the series. So yeah, so like again, like part of what makes that work is those villain characters and the way it just all kind of like ties into the narrative and overall motivations of the people in question.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
So also, you know, with some, has anyone watched The Leftovers? Do you ever watch that show? No? Okay, I won't go into that. Well, it's a good one. But, you know, there's also some characters in movies, like one of my favorite directors is Paul Thomas Anderson. And, you know, there's a lot of characters in his movies that aren't necessarily that likable, but they're just so stand out. Like I'm gonna throw out The Master, even though that's not my favorite of his, because I just think that Philip Seymour Hoffman and Joaquin Phoenix in that movie, both of their performances and their characters are just so like intense and so compelling that, you know, I have to at least like throw them out. But yeah, and then everybody obviously in Magnolia and stuff too. But also, you know, Daniel Day-Lewis in There Will Be Blood. I don't know if anyone's seen all those.
I've seen most. I'm disappointed this didn't come to me before you mentioned it, actually, because There Will Be Blood is probably one of my favorite. Not to be a cliche, right? Because like every guy my age, like, you know, seems to think There Will Be Blood is the best film ever, right? But it is very good, right? Anyway, but Paul Thomas Anderson's films in general, like. Yeah, there's a lot of very well realized characters there. Again, where like the writing comes together with the performance. I think Magnolia that you mentioned is one. You've also got Phantom Thread as well. I think The Master is an interesting one though, because it's not my favorite of his films. I mean, I say that I can't think of any of his that I actively dislike, right? So I mean, that's not to say I dislike it. I think it's fantastic, but it's an interesting one in that it's not my favorite of his, but those two characters really do stand out. And I think part of that is because of what you said, Kristy, is the intensity of the performance from both Joaquin Phoenix and Philip Seymour Hoffman. But that's an interesting one. That like a lot of his characters are not. They're not showy for long stretches of the film, and then they'll have these moments where it's just like that bottled up intensity just comes like, you know, piling, you know, flowing out. So yeah, it's an interesting one, that I think. Yeah.
Yeah, and Joaquin Phoenix definitely has a lot of those moments in that movie.
Yeah.
And no, that's not one of my, like, I mean, I love all his movies, and that's not my favorite, but those performances do just stand out. And Daniel Day-Lewis in general has probably a lot of characters. You know, I love him in Gangs of New York.
Yeah.
Yes. Fan. But you know, Bill, he is just like iconic in that movie. He is so amazing, and you actually do have sympathy for him too, even though he's the obvious like villain of the movie. And I think that's mainly because of the dynamic between him and Leonardo DiCaprio, primarily. Which, you know.
Yeah, definitely. I'm going to get a lot of heat for this. I really dislike Wes Anderson and his films. I'm so sorry. I can appreciate it.
If I had sleeves, I'd roll them up right now.
I'm so sorry. I don't actively hate them, but I can appreciate them and the visuals of it. But I think the way he writes and portrays characters is a very bizarre one. I feel like they're always just one aspect of a character. I think a really good example of a character I can't stand is Gustav from Grand Budapest Hotel. Even though it's played brilliantly by Ralph Fiennes, it's beautiful performance, but I think as a character, it's annoying, so annoying. And I know people are going to hate me so much for this, but I had to say it.
I think Wes Anderson. I mean, I really like his movies. I'm not someone who's I'm not gonna roll my sleeves up. They're already rolled up. I never. Yeah. But I think you have to almost think of what he's doing as something different than traditional narrative cinema. And I think his characters are not. I think they're purposefully not well developed. I think that they are meant to be set pieces like the rest of the visuals in the movie, right? And so that's my only defense of Wes Anderson, is that I think he's trying to do something that's very idiosyncratic, is what I would say. And so,
I mean, that's the thing. Like, so you know that whole thing about, you know, like the most anti-smoking people are like people who've stopped smoking, right? Yeah. To a certain extent, and I don't want to make out like I'm some sort of like Wes Anderson zealot here, right? I'm not, but like I'm basically the equivalent of that for him, because the first Wes Anderson film I saw was Fantastic Mr. Fox, and I hated it. I hated it with an absolute passion. It was, and I think the only time, and then I watched, I think it was Rushmore and Bottle Rocket after that, and I liked them. But I don't think I really connected with his films until Moonrise Kingdom, right? I think that was the first one where I kind of, you know, because I also didn't like the Royal Tenenbaums. I could take or leave the Darjeeling Limited. I think Moonrise Kingdom was the first one where I really connected with it. And I think, Danny, you've hit upon something with it there. I think his characters are intentionally slight, right? They're basically meant to, and particularly in the case of Moonrise Kingdom, when you look at kind of like, you know, the star-crossed kids, like they're not necessarily deep, but they're very easily identified characters and feelings that you can then relate to. And you can also see that, I think, in kind of what is the, you know, somebody who in some ways feels like he's played the same character a lot of times. What is a good example of stunt casting in Bruce Willis in that film, right? Because he plays this kind of like this old, tired police officer, basically, and it's sort of like you can feel all the weight of kind of like his previous roles in that, you know, all these Die Hard films, all this, all that. So in that case, so that's an interesting way to go about characters in a different way. It's like rather than having this full rounded thing, it's like that stripped down version where it's like an emotion or feeling or something you can identify with. I'm not going to defend Wes Anderson too hard because I think, as we all know, he's a very idiosyncratic style, right? I don't begrudge you not liking his films. I can easily see how that happens. I happen to have kind of like come around and I really like them, but it is one of those filmmaking styles, and within that is the idea of the characters, where you either find something that makes you click with it or you don't. So yeah, but no, it's interesting. It's a different approach to characters. I don't think there's any in his films that are necessarily complex in the way of some of the other ones we've spoken about, but it doesn't necessarily make them any less compelling.
Yeah,
it's true. It's well put. And I love Royal Tenenbaums and Grand Budapest Hotel. Those two are my favorites of his, and I've been watching him for a long time. So I'm on the Wes Anderson, but you know, yeah. So I'm trying to think. Oh, you know, speaking of like comedy kind of characters in a sense, I love the Coen brothers, and I think a lot of their characters have, you know, and many of them are also not very good people, or they're doing bad things, but they often have really interesting, compelling characters and very funny, sometimes darker than others, you know, but those are some ones that stand out, you know, like Marge from Fargo, or I mean, pretty much everybody in No Country for Old Men, including Javier Bardem as the villain. He's just like, yeah, come on. And
great.
Yeah, and then, you know, you also have like the dude, like Big Lebowski, which I have my bowling ball right there. But yeah, so those are just some of, like, other than like Wes Anderson, like kind of quirky humor characters, those are some other ones. And then there's also some Judd Apatow, I guess, comedic characters that stand out. But I don't know, I love the dark humor, so those are often ones that resonate.
Yeah, I think that Marge Gunderson is a good one, actually, because it's also a reasonably, because it's funny if you look at any, like, because there was an AFI list of, like, you know, heroes and villains or something, like a number of years ago. I can't remember exactly when it was, but it's also, it's notable how few on the heroes list were women, and it's interesting when you then look at the ones that are, because Marge Gunderson, I think is one of them, but, you know, quite low down. But she fits into that category along with, I think I would also put Ellen Ripley there, you know, Sigourney Weaver's character from the Alien films, whereby they are female heroes, but they are also female heroes. Like, they're not just you know, like empty roles that have been written and filmed by a female actor. There are actually kind of like aspects to that character which are enhanced or could only come through with a female role. And I think in the case of Marge Gunderson, the fact that she's pregnant throughout the film basically is a key part of that. That series also has got quite a good record for that, because Molly, I forget the name, Alison something, but the TV series, the first series of the TV series, Molly Solverson, that is another character, and it's very much in the Marge Gunderson mold, as you can imagine from that. But it's also another example of a female. The hero is maybe struck as, like, you know, hero, you think like capes and stuff, right? But a female protagonist, which is really well realized and performed. So, like, I think the influence of that Marge Gunderson character on stuff that came after as well is so important. Yeah,
she was very courageous, very. You know, despite being pregnant and, you know, maybe being out of her, you know, element at times, I guess she's very confident. She just goes right for it, and she's an amazing character. And Frances McDormand, always awesome.
Yeah, I think the Coen brothers are interesting because I feel like they're a little different than Wes Anderson, but not entirely. I think that they have like a central, very often, I'm not saying, I'm sure you can find cases where this isn't true, but they have a central, really well-developed character like Marge, or like just the guy from A Serious Man, if you've ever seen that movie, right? This really well-developed character who is surrounded by like filmic types, like archetypal, right? That don't have any depth. They're just sort of images of characters that you've seen in other genre, and within the genre that the movie is part of, right? And so it's almost like they put a real fleshed out human being in a kind of thought experiment about genre, surrounded by archetypes. And so I love the Coen brothers. Like, I could go on all day about the Coen brothers, but yeah.
Yeah, me too. Trust me. Yeah, and Michael Spielberg and Serious Man's terrific. So is Inside Llewyn Davis, which is one that I feel kind of gets lost a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, totally.
You know, that's probably my favorite Coen brothers film, because I feel, again, it's a film where very little happens, but it feels a very rewarding experience nonetheless. The film, they're like, well, what happens in it? Not much, but it's incredibly, again, Oscar Isaac is really good. But I feel like Coen brother films, they've got so much to say about the world that they're portraying, and they're very rich sort of worlds. They're not there just to, you know, look pretty, but they also portray something quite real, for me at least.
Yeah.
And so I know that Danny has to go. So is there anything else, any characters that we didn't get to, anything you want to throw out before?
Could I throw one out? I guess it goes to the writing. There's certain characters that are just sort of, there's always a moment when someone's going to reinvent this character. And I'm thinking of like Sherlock Holmes. Okay. How many different versions of Sherlock Holmes have we seen that have been made very contemporary in all those moments? Right. And so one of my first, I think I said this on the last video chat we had about the old Basil Rathbone Sherlock Holmes movies with Nigel Bruce as Watson. I grew up on those things too, on late night TV, right? And so that was very much out of film noir, right? And that moment of Hollywood. But he's been made postmodern with the Benedict Cumberbatch Sherlock series, right? I particularly think that Andrew Scott's Moriarty is like one of the great TV characters of all time. His take on Moriarty is just fantastic, and his performance is just so unnerving and yet enticing at the same time. I could just watch his face twitch and for 3 hours, right? And so yeah, I think that Sherlock Holmes is a character that allows really great actors to do something that's kind of specific to their time, based on this kind of timeless character. And so I just wanted to kind of throw that out there as an example of somebody that TV keeps going back to all the time. One of my favorite TV series from the 90s was the Law and Order Criminal Intent with Vincent D'Onofrio, and his Bobby Gorin, which I found finally reruns on some WeTV or something. I've been filling up my DVR with old episodes of this, and his Bobby Gorin is basically a take on Sherlock Holmes, and Olivia d'Abo was on that series as his Moriarty kind of foil. And so, I mean, that's a character that is always contemporary for some reason.
I mean, in terms of reinvented, like characters that are constantly reinvented, I mean, I suppose a key one is James Bond, really. I mean, I mean, when you think about like how different those iterations, like basically, as far as I can, depending on who's playing James Bond, I can love or hate the film, really. Like I cannot stand Roger Moore. I just cannot. I hate it. It's so bad, right? I mean, it's just like, you know, it's like you take all the like slightly worrisome, questionable aspects of that character, and it's like, oh, I know what we'll do. We'll give it to like an absolutely smarmy asshole. Like, no, absolutely not. But you know, and like not to be biased, right? But obviously, like my preferred one is probably Sean Connery. Big surprise, but you know, it's just like that character, right? It basically lives or dies on how good the actor is in the role, right? But then also the writing as well, because like Pierce Brosnan started off good, and then it just went off a cliff edge, or you know, off an ice cliff parasailing or whatever. But so in terms of like characters that are reinvented, like Sherlock Holmes is one. I think James Bond would be another. I think we're getting. I think if you come back to it in like 10 years or so, like a lot of the superheroes we're seeing right now will be in that category. I mean, we've already seen like Umpty Thrumpty Batman. You know. I think eventually you'll probably get to that stage with others. So, like, you're right. They reflect the time in which they're made, because obviously, like Michael Keaton's Batman is very different to Christian Bale's, and both are wildly, wildly different to Adam West's. You know, so I think when you find those characters, it's quite interesting, because it's quite interesting to see just how wildly they can vary from iteration to iteration.
I think what's also really interesting is how our perception of characters can change over time. I don't think Jim and Danny might agree with me on this, or you might not have a personal experience in this, but a character like that is Carrie Bradshaw from Sex and the City. Because you grow up, you're a young woman, you watch it, and Carrie's kind of the center of the TV series, and it's fun and it's sexy and it's a little bit naughty. And you watch her and you're like, oh my God, you do a BuzzFeed quiz and you want to get Carrie out of that personality quiz. And then 10 years later, you realize that she's a terrible character and a terrible human being. Really? Yeah,
I've watched altogether more of that show than I think people would expect me to.
Oh yes.
So
are you a Carrie or are you a Miranda?
I don't know. I've got it because it was so many years ago now. I've got to parse them all. But I'm not a Carrie, I don't think. That's. But I went through this recently. Like I went to see, like in terms of like again the kind of like the reinterpretation of literary characters. I went through this kind of like which one are you when I went to see Greta Gerwig's Little Women recently. And that was an interesting one, because like especially as a Brit, like you know, like people know of Little Women the book here, but it doesn't hold the same kind of like, you know, cultural status it does in the States. And of course it's always like, you know, which one of the March sisters are you? And I found it interesting afterwards to find out that there was this real kind of like hatred for Amy, you know, who was played by Florence Pugh in that version of the film, because I looked at that and I was kind of like, well, yeah, I mean, she's a bit bratty at points, but like, you know, you kind of understand where a lot of it's coming from. I think she was portrayed quite sympathetically. So it was just interesting to find out that on the basis of reading the book and watching previous adaptations, that character comes out as the one that like nobody wants to be associated with. So in that case of like reinterpreting characters, that would be another one in terms of like, you know, which one you identify with. It can change wildly again depending on the iteration that you've ended up watching.
Yeah.
Well, and Maria makes a great point. I think that's one of the great things about art in general, right? Is if I read a book or watch a movie when I'm 20 and read it again when I'm 30, I'm an entirely different person, right? And so it's a way for you to kind of judge your own growth as a human being on how you kind of re-engage with these artworks. And it doesn't make Sex and the City any less of a good series. Maybe it does. I don't know. I didn't watch that, but your kind of relationship to it has changed, and I think that's what's beautiful about it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I loved the 90s Little Women. And then, you know, I was like, Winona Ryder all the way. I'm Joe. And I just wonder if any girl watching that wants to be anyone but Joe. But, you know, I don't know. As far as like, what character do you want to be? I mean, I love them all for different reasons. And Amy, you know, that's just kind of her character. It's the same thing with Kirsten Dunst. And I'm trying to think of the woman that plays her when she's older in the other one, but you know, and same with Florence, you know, the character has like a growth, you know, and so I don't know why she would get like people would dislike her, but I mean, that's what's amazing about that story is that they're all very different, and they kind of represent different, I don't know, like faces of female journey and mind and everything. So I think it's an interesting conversation or consideration. But yeah, that's just me because I always wanted to be Joe.
Yeah, I think when I was talking about it before, we eventually the whole like it represents different aspects. I think the preferred method seemed to be to declare yourself a percentage of each Marxist, or
right.
You know, like I'm 40% Joe, I'm 20% like that. That seemed to be the preferred method in the end, rather than an all or nothing scenario.
Yeah, no, it's probably the safest bet to do.
And can I just say, I embarrassed myself in the theater watching that movie because I actually like openly wept, like sobbed out loud, like at one moment in the movie. Or actually, I tried to cover my mouth because it was like kind of like it was a really, really big cry. So, yeah.
No shame. We're film lovers. I get scared up sometimes.
We all did it.
Or like if I hear a score of a film I love, I get a little choked up. So, no judgment.
Yeah.
So yeah, this was a lot of fun. I think we had some really good conversations going. We talked about a lot of different characters, and the thing is, we could probably do this for like hours more and still not even scratch the surface on that, because there's just so many, and there's so many different types, and yeah, so much that goes into it. Like we discussed, the writing, the acting, and just yeah. So yeah, so with that, that's the end of the Film Inquiry Roundtable 2. Thank you again, everybody, for joining. I love meeting and seeing everybody, and I hope everyone that watches this enjoys it and share their own favorite characters. And I hope everyone's doing well and keeping safe. And I know that these times are just unprecedented and crazy, so it's great to be able to have these fun, interactive moments of appreciation for film and TV. So thank you very much again.
Thank you.
Thank you.